Hello, everyone. My name is Lara De Mori. I'm the Marcello Rumma Fellow in Contemporary Italian Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I would like to welcome you on my behalf and on behalf of my fellow organizer, Amanda Srocca. Hi, Amanda, say hi. Who is the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is our third program of the Production of the Self, Conversation about Marisa Merz. We started already 2 weeks ago, and we had Connie Butler giving us a beautiful and intimate portrait of Marisa and her practice, and also insight about the exhibition, Marisa Merz, The Sky is a Great Place. Then last week we had Lara Conte, who talked to us about Marisa's cinematic experimentations. And today we will welcome Teresa Kittler from York University, giving us a presentation on Marisa Merz, action, interactions, and performative sculptures. But before, let me do a few housekeeping notes. So you see that below the screen, you have the function of the chat, and Charlotte has already welcomed you on the chat. So after Teresa's presentation, there will be time for Q&A. You are currently muted, and you will be muted for the rest of the session, but there is a chance, starting from now till the end of the session, of writing comments and questions. So after Teresa's presentation, we will do our best to read as many questions from the chat as possible. So this program has been recorded, but not the Q&A portion. So for you to feel more comfortable in asking about whatever you want. The recordings are available on the Italian Cultural Institute of New York website on the dedicated page to the event of Marisa Merz. Connie's talk is already up there. And they will be like uploaded weekly. So if you miss one of these events, please do visit that page and you can see the recordings. So we started, as I said, 2 weeks ago, and our last event will be 21st of October, every week from noon to 1 Eastern Standard Time. So this program is organized in conjunction of the dedicated artist room at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The artist room was made possible thanks to the collaboration with the artist herself during a lifetime, the Fondazione Merzs, and a host of lenders. And you can see some works on the screen. So Marisa Merz belongs to a generation of women artists born between the early mid-20s and the early 30s, who needed to learn how to negotiate between the private, the domestic, and the public dimensions of their existence. Among these women, there were artists like Carla Cardi, Tommaso Binga, Giusetta Fioroni, and writers, intellectuals, and poets like Carla Lonzi, Dacia Maraini, Amelia Rostelli, and particularly, I want to remember the great journalist and politician, Rossana Rossanda, who passed away 3 days ago, who had been for some time the spokesperson of the Italian Communist Party and the founder of the journal Il Manifesto. Merz was also part of the artistic milieu of Arte Povera, a trend formed by a group of artists brought together by art critic Germano Celent in 1967, who reacted to the constraints and the obsession with mass consumption they saw affecting trends like minimalism and pop art. In doing so, they adopted unconventional and natural materials in the attempt to connect art and life. Truly, Merz never identified with the group and developed a very distinguished language, a system of signs characterized by the use of multiple media, as you can see, like the sculptures, like the testine that we have on show as well, recalling pre-anthropomorphic forms molded in a rather unfinished manner. Drawings also, prefigures that are arranged in the pictorial space, often in the guise of ancient icons, and installations of various sorts, from folded aluminium structures to interwoven copper wires and performances. And I believe that indeed, Teresa, we start her presentation talking about Marisa's action at the Urbe airport in 1970. So all these media are combined by a very tactile appearance, and here you can see the violin, and by a keen attention of the process of making in the actions of knitting, cutting, and sewing. So before I introduce today's speaker, I want also to thank our sponsors, the Italian Consulate in Philadelphia, the Italian Cultural Institute of New York, and the Dietrich Fund for Excellence in Contemporary Art. So Teresa Kittler is a lecturer in modern and contemporary art at York University, and this year she's also the scholar in residence at Magazzino Italian Art. So when she will come over, we will be neighbors. We're really looking for that. Her research focuses on artistic practices from 1945 to present day, with a special interest in Italian post-war art. She has been the recipient of many fellowships from the British Academy, Librium, the British School at Rome, and the Center for Italian Modern Art. Her research on Carla Cardi has been published on the Oxford Art Journal, and she has been written on Marisa Merz for the catalog accompanying the exhibitions Marisa Merz, The Sky is a Great Place, Hammer Museum and Met Museum in 2017, and Entrare nell'Opera, Kunstmuseum Liechtenstein 2019. She has also worked as assistant curator for the 10th Guangzhou Biennale in 2014, and I've already had the pleasure to listen to Teresa presenting on Carla Lonzi and Habitat, an Italian TV program of the 70s. And today she will again talk about Marisa Merz. Over to you, Teresa. We're very happy to have you here.
I want to start by saying how struck I was by the way that Connie Butler spoke about Marisa Merz's ambivalent relationship to her own image a couple of weeks ago. To see the very personal and unguarded photographs of the artist and her studio taken during the research trip for the exhibition Marisa Merz, The Sky is a Great Space, gave me a rare glimpse into a world that has always been tantalizingly out of reach. Today, I want to take up that thread, the resistance that the artist has shown towards her own image, to share some thoughts that I had when I was invited to contribute to a project about performance and arte povera. That project not only sought to underscore the significance of performative practices, the language of theatre, the emphasis on action, the use of props for our understanding of that movement, but also to highlight the extent to which the artists associated with arte povera have contributed to the vocabulary of this form. I was interested in exploring how Merz's often ambivalent relationship to her own image is played through in her work, and how, in turn, this offers a unique take on the language of performance. To reiterate the insights of Carlos Basualdo in his introduction to the artist at the start of this series of talks, it has often been from a marginal position that Merz has transformed our understanding of artistic practice. I want to begin with a well-known sequence, and one which we have heard mentioned in a previous talk, of photographs taken by Claudio Abate on the 28th of February 1970 at Urbe, a small private airport in the outskirts of Rome. These photographs are the surviving testimony of an action realized by Marisa Merz to mark the opening of her solo exhibition at Fabio Sargentini's L'Attico Gallery in Rome. The photographs documenting the event show Merz with Sargentini and her partner Mario Merz on the tarmac of Urbe airfield before Marisa climbs aboard a 1959 Cessna. Circling above Rome with her co-pilot, Merz radioed down her altitude to Sargentini. This was then recorded by the gallerist onto a graph and later exhibited in the show. This so-called action by Merz acknowledges a debt to the futurists, the early pioneers of performative art practices whose own fascination with aviation is well documented. And indeed the echoes of futurism in Marisa Merz's work is also discussed by Butler in her catalogue essay for The Sky is a Great Space. When Filippo Tommaso Marinetti published his political novel in free verse, the Pope's monoplane in 1912, he was already enthralled to air travel. Fueled by modern military developments, he exalted flight and the promise of new aerial perspectives. Marinetti went on to collaborate with Fede Lazzari on a dictionary of aeronautical terms in 1929, as aviation became a central trope in the futurist imagination, giving rise to a whole range of visual expressions in the form of aeropittura, aerodanza, and aerofotografia, amongst many others, that convey the experience of aerial prospects, of spiraling movement, and the God's eye view, as you see in this example of Aeropittura by Tato, or in the vertiginous inverted perspectives of Crowley's upside down loop, and the plunging lines of Massueto's photography. When Marinetti and his fellow futurists published their manifesto of aeropainting in 1929, they spoke of a new reality constructed by perpetual mobility, and seemed to insist on the performative character of this form of painting, with their demand that the painter should not observe and paint, except by participating in their very velocity. In Merz's reinvention of this genre, however, the sober record that was exhibited at Lattico Gallery does not share in the theatricalized rhetoric associated with the futurist manifestos, nor with their dizzying perspectives. Rather, it reimagines it with a more restrained vocabulary, one more befitting of the conceptual art practices that were emerging in this period. Significantly, Merz's flight above Rome was one of only a handful of so-called actions realized by the artist, and one of even fewer examples in which the artist herself is seen to perform. Nevertheless, I would argue that throughout the 60s and early 70s, Merz's practice offers a sustained engagement with the vocabulary of performance. So, whilst I don't want to propose that all her work falls under this category, nor do I want to suggest that the term becomes so capacious that it risks losing all meaning, I do want to consider how her sculptural work of this period evinces a marked interest in the interaction of the body, temporality, and space, attributes we associate with the language of performance. And if her own body is not always directly involved, it is more often than not registered through the work that she made and its staging. So I want to take you through a few examples of some of her early work, many of which are by now quite well known, including her two so-called actions. But I want to put the emphasis on the artist's commitment to liveness, physical movement, and impermanence, and in this way underscoring the commitment in her work to the vocabulary of performance. There is also something performative about Merz's self-presentation, which has long been characterized by her silence, quite literally in the recently discovered film that we heard Lara Conte speak so eloquently about last week, in which the artist sat at her kitchen table, silently sorts and counts a bowl of peas. Or elsewhere, and often remarked upon in the literature, her refusal and silence to engage with the discourse or conventions of art history and its criticism. What you see here is a double-page spread of a special report in Notiziario Arte Contemporanea on the artistic scene in Turin in 1973. Part of a series of special issues published by that journal, in which well-known critics had been asked to comment on current practices in Italy. Merz features but here completely disregards the rules of the game. Rather than engage in dialogue with the critic and historian Mirella Bandini, as did so many of the artists included in that issue, who responded on the whole quite straightforwardly to the questions posed, Merz deflected attention from her work, preferring instead to publish an altogether different kind of exchange, a scripted conversation with her daughter Beatrice over what to eat for lunch, putting the spotlight on a domestic setting and her store-cupboard ingredients to discuss what the pair might eat. In this way, Merz turns the artist's interview on its head, refusing the role assigned to her as artist, and so, in this case, as respondent, and instead assuming the position of interviewer to her daughter Beatrice. For all its brevity, the published dialogue, somewhere between absurdist drama and philosophical meditation, manages to offer a reflection on the changing nature of desire. But what I find so interesting about this example is that it highlights how the artist seems to straddle the line between visibility and invisibility. She features in this issue documenting some of the most significant artists working in Turin at the time, but in the same breath hides away from the limelight, and in doing so reinvents or offers something quite imaginative in place of the artist's interview. And just as she refused to be labelled by critics, so at the heart of Merz's approach is a refusal to fix her work. There's a line in Chris Kraus's Torpor, in a longer passage that recounts a failed attempt of one of the book's protagonists to write a history of the Second World War, that is apt here and worth repeating in this context. Like Kraus's protagonist, Marisa Merz seems to share the sense that when a story has been fully told, it's over, and that to organise events sequentially is to take away their power, both quotes from that book. We see this refusal to fix her work, or as other speakers have underscored, this commitment to the idea of art as process in one of Merz's earliest sculptures, Untitled of 1966. A work which was reimagined with each installation. A work that refuses to be fixed or pinned down. And it's this aspect that lends it a performative or live quality. The artist made this work using strips of aluminium foil cut from larger sheets. These were repurposed through a process of cutting and stapling to form loops that were joined together, one loop overlapping another. And here you see a detail of the work from a conservationist report and the evidence of that process described. In this way, the sculpture slowly and laboriously grew outwards and lengthways into what was effectively a giant tube. Some of these tubes were gathered together to create knot-like formations, as you see here. These were then strewn across Merz's house, hung from the ceiling, in a curtain around her TV set, and piled in corners, as you see here above the kitchen cooker. By describing the process of making the work as humble and modest as embroidery, Merz seems to want to underscore the artlessness of the process involved, one more befitting of the practices associated with homemaking. This association is further reinforced by Merz's claim that Untitled functioned as an index of the time spent caring for Beatrice, as if the sculpture could somehow quantify the labour involved in childcare. Certainly the photographs of the work show the vastness of such a task as it colonizes Merz's home studio, compromising the artist's own living space. On another occasion, the artist spoke of the work as an obstacle, as if Untitled should function as a form of encounter or as a means of disrupting its environment. It's as if the work could have a life of its own, something that Beatrice Merz underscored when she recalled that as a child, she'd been scared of the sculpture. Merz took advantage of Untitled's potential for transformation and permutation. Throughout 1967, the work was shown on a number of different occasions and locations across Turin, including at the Piper Pluri Club, whose interior you see here. With other comparable venues built in Florence, Rimini, Milan, and Rome, the Piper Pluri Club, designed by the collective Gruppo Strum, was a new genre of architecture that had sprung up across Italy and had become a key trope of radical architecture and site for experimental artistic practice. This was certainly the case for Turin's Pluri Club, which was envisaged as a site for music, theatre, and happenings. Flexibility, the Piper's mantra, and the club's design incorporated elements that lent themselves to the shifting demands of the event staged there. Pietro de Rossi and his wife Graziella were closely involved with the artistic scene in Italy at the time and organised a series of events, of which Marisa Merz's Environment, as that iteration of her work was called, was the last in the lineup for 1967. For that event, Merz's metal sculptures were organised around the club in groupings, as you see here and here, to create an aluminium show range from above, to borrow a phrase from the review written by Tommaso Trini for Domus. The artist and critic Piero Gilardi, who'd attended the opening night, observed Marisa Merz's happening taking place, full of fabulously dressed people, lots of flowers, Marisa's works hanging, and a strong smell of incense. The full complement of the senses were brought together in this particular staging of the work, whilst Gilardi's description of it as a happening, a term that underscores the informality and spontaneity of the event and foregrounds the involvement of the audience, who effectively became performers against the backdrop of Merz's Environment. And through her work, there's an ongoing interest in the artwork's effect on the viewer and the dynamics between artist, audience, and work. Beatrice Merz was not alone in identifying the monstrous or Galatea-like quality of the work. In an article for Art Forum, Germano Cellant described it as nocturnal, visceral, almost a universe, moving, throbbing with any puff of air to form a tin monster, something inhuman, suspended in silence, in ways that echo how the filmmakers Tonino De Bernardi and Paolo Menzio had envisaged Untitled for their debut film, Il Mostro Verde, The Green Monster, where Merz's sculpture was in fact cast as the protagonist of the 24-minute filmic experiment, the insides of the green monster serpent. Projected on a split screen, the film was organised around 3 episodes: a primal scene of Adam and Eve in Arcadia with Taylor Mead, the star of several underground films shot in Andy Warhol's factory as the Green Serpent, a subterranean landscape whose inhabitants are consumed by a hybrid monster pairing of Dracula and Frankenstein, and a final episode of rebirth in which the characters emerge above ground, running and screaming in a barren wasteland to a sound track of Afghan folk music and Allen Ginsberg's protest poem, Howl. So what you're looking at here is that split screen that simultaneously offers two perspectives, and the filmmakers really experiment with the narrative and dramatic possibilities afforded by this technique. And this is particularly the case in the second of the 3 episodes in which Merz's sculpture is transformed into a monster. In a 6-minute sequence, the sculpture is staged in such a way as to form the dark and disorientating cavernous interior of the monster, where the distinction between sculpture as setting and sculpture as the subject of performance is collapsed. Here you see a number of screenshots of that episode, which centers on Merz's sculpture, and where you're able to see the insides of the monster on the right, as well as an external view. So I'm going to show you a brief clip of the film to give you a sense of how the drama unfolds and the sculpture is brought to life. So I'm just going to share 1 minute of this rather strange film with you. Okay. Okay, I'll stop it there. Significantly, in the final shots of this scene, the actors end up interacting with the work. Body parts, heads, legs, and arms are filmed inside or wearing the aluminium sculpture. In this way, dramatizing the narrative struggle between the characters and the monster. De Bernardi has since described his treatment of the sculpture as another actor in the film, and emphasized the experimental possibilities afforded by the sculpture as it interacted with the naked bodies in the scene. It's easy to see why the work soon acquired the title of living sculpture, which underscores the sense of animation produced through the endless permutations of the work and literally animated in the film, and gives a nod of recognition to the experimental New York-based group, the Living Theatre, a group so influential for the development of art world performance, and which had spent an extended period of time in Italy in the 60s, performing at the Piper Pluri Club in 67, and as we heard last week, even hosted by the Merzs during their stay. The title it came to acquire also refers to the genre of living sculpture that had emerged in the 60s in the work of Piero Manzoni and Yves Klein, and later glimpsed in the work of Gilbert and George and Yannis Kanellis, amongst others, who've continued to shape our understanding of the category of performative sculpture. Just as De Bernardi and Menzio had done so in their debut film, Merz took advantage of the experimental possibilities afforded by the camera. She makes use of photographic staging to render her work in an expressive way. In advance of her solo exhibition held at Giannenzo Spirone's gallery in Turin in June of 1967, she had the sculpture photographed outdoors. There are a number of artists in Italy working with this form of staging. We might think of Pino Pascali with his bristle brushworms in the countryside outside of Rome, or the sculpture of artists like Gino Marotta, or Eliseo Mattiacci's Tube of '67, which was taken for a walk as part of an action for La Tartaruga Gallery in Rome. And even the products of industrial design were often photographed outdoors to trade on certain associations with nature, or else to collapse the distinctions between nature and artifice, as well as disrupt the conventions of viewing work. The poster that was printed for Merz's solo exhibition shows Untitled hanging from the tree in the artist's garden in Turin. The sculpture constituted an extension of its branches, and the arrangement of the work inside the gallery echoes the photographic staging, as if the sculpture were the outcome of a set of biological processes rather than aesthetic decisions, contributing to the idea of the work as having a life of its own. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Merz would continue to experiment with photography, taking her objects outside the traditional circuits of exhibiting and viewing work, and envisaging a range of alternative locations for them. Such staging had been from the outset an express aim of the artist. As early as 1966, Merz had spoken in an interview of her desire to experience the work outside of her home, which she describes as an inevitable and predetermined context, and which, as Connie Butler put it in her contribution, parallels or echoes the move of commercial galleries at this time from more domestic arrangement to industrial setting. Photography therefore plays an integral role for the experience of her sculpture and for the way in which Merz's sculptural practice can be understood as performative. In counterpoint to the action in the sky, the action at Regina in 1970 took place by the sea. On this occasion, Merz's sculptural objects took center stage. Her rolled up blankets of 1967, a pair of little knitted nylon shoes, the small letters BEA, amongst other works, were all relocated to the beach. Merz's knitted nylon shoes were photographed as if they were sea sponges that had been thrown up onto the shore. The letters that formed the diminutive of Beatrice, Bea, and O on the ground, were destroyed and carried away by the waves. Another sequence of photographs shows Mario Merz interacting with Marisa's blankets. Abate's photographs capture Mario on the beach. Two of Marisa's rolled blankets hang unceremoniously from his shoulders. One of the blankets has been released and appears in the same photograph on the beach directed towards the shore. Another in that series shows the rolled blanket lapped by the spray of the breaking waves, as if the sculpture come sea snake were capable of swimming away. In this way, Marisa Merz experimented with varying combinations of interaction between sculpture, body, and environment. The sculptures are made to move, swim, absorb water. Mario Merz has even captured in this sequence of photographs struggling with the size and weight of the unwieldy blankets, which throw him off balance. What I want to suggest is that these images demonstrate how photography can powerfully script, choreograph, and otherwise animate sculpture, and in this way redefine it as something mobile and provisional. Marisa Merz did not appear in this series, as far as I know. Neither was this action conceived for an immediate audience. As in the case of The Flight Above Rome, this performance is mediated through photography, which effectively displaces its reception temporally and geographically. There is something seemingly paradoxical about these works. They're at the same time quite private and yet show Merz at her most performative. Such works were not repeated and so are now accessible through photographic reproduction alone. And so, by way of a final example, during the process of installing her exhibition at L'Attico Gallery in 1975, Merz was photographed with her back turned away from the camera as she sits at a window under the moonlight, wearing her knitted nylon slippers and overlooking the streets of Rome. The photograph of this impromptu performance was not included in the exhibition. Instead, the shoes were hung on the wall in the position where Merz's feet had rested on 2 consecutive evenings, one of which was caught on camera. The presence of the artist's body and her position in relation to her work is registered here, just as it had been on the graph produced during the action at Urbe Airport. This is characteristic of the way that Merz engaged with the vocabulary of performance, indirectly, out of sight, or by means of displacement. It's indicative of her contribution to the vocabulary of performance art as it developed in Italy throughout the 60s. Performance reimagined privately, intimately, and away from the audience. Camera shy, mute, her back turned. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, for this wonderful presentation and this very, I don't know, somehow very intimate handing with Marisa Merz giving us the back, but still very intimate portrait.